So welcome to the breakout on digital accessibility and intersectionality. And I do want to open by saying we would really like this session to be a discussion. So we have our prep slides, but Christopher and I love to be interrupted. So raise your hands, relate your experiences. I really appreciated this morning when Darren talked about, not just living in your body, but living your story. And, as people who do research, who work in the community, we're always gathering data, but that data is telling us a story of lived experiences. And so please do interrupt us. Let's chat. We have some questions prepped at the end, and we do plan on having some discussion time at the end, but we'd love it if you talk to us throughout.
To seed the conversation, are there any questions that you're coming in here with today? Just open and to learn, or any specific questions or challenges you're experiencing? We may not answer right this second, but just to put out there around digital accessibility.
They don't know what
Start thinking. We'll have some chance to discuss at the end.
So our objectives for this session are to understand the importance of digital accessibility, understanding the legal requirements around digital accessibility, and then having a review and a discussion around digital accessibility and how it intersects with all of our own individual identifying factors.
Just quickly define, what does digital accessibility mean?
We have several slides on that.
Okay.
And yeah, so we're gonna get there.
Okay.
I'm gonna. I said ask questions, but now I'm like I'm gonna hold it till I get to the slide. But let us tell you who we are first, and then we'll go from there. So I'm Brenda Smith. We are from Utah State University. We're with a program called Academy, which I've got another slide on. I'll define the acronym for you. But we work in the space of digital accessibility in K through 12 education. I have a PhD in disability disciplines, and I've worked for 12 years at the Institute for Disability Research Policy and Practice at USU. Personally, I have 2 kids who've had IEPs, but I also have more pets than I should admit. I don't like I bring the pets up every time, but I have a lot of pets too, so not just children. I've lived in Utah my whole life, grew up in a pretty rural community, up in Cache County, and so that's me. Christopher, you want to introduce yourself?
Christopher and I professionally have a background in special education and technology, kind of a variety of different projects. And so this role with Academy has been a really good opportunity to kind of bring those two worlds together. This project in Academy just started about 6 months in October. And so fairly new there. Prior to that, I did digital accessibility for Utah State University. It's kind of coordinating efforts there. So yeah, really excited for the conversation today.
I'm a terrible presenter because I wander, and now I realize I'm being recorded, so I should probably stay within the camera view. But Academy, as Christopher mentioned, we're a new technical assistance center. We're funded out of the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. Funding started in October and goes for 4 years. And our mission is to improve the quality, availability, and timely provision of accessible digital educational materials and instruction for learners with disabilities from preschool up through high school graduation. And as we mentioned, we're at Utah State University, and our staff mostly come from 2 different programs at the Institute. One is a program called WebAIM, Web Accessibility in Mind, that just celebrated its 25th anniversary at USU, providing support around digital accessibility. And then another program called the Center for Technical Assistance for Excellence in Special Education, which has been helping school districts and state departments of special education meet federal requirements under the Individuals with Disability Education Act since the 80s. And then under this, yes, that was it. Perfect. Thank you. Under our grant, we have 5 targeted recipient groups, and one is state and local education agencies, so your State Department of Special Education, local school districts. We also work with Part C lead agencies, which is your birth to 3-year-old services. So working with them to prep kids and their families to use accessible materials once they get to the classroom. We also support other federally funded centers through the Office of Special Education Program. That's the OSEP TA&D centers. We work with parent information centers, and then we're also working with teacher prep programs to make sure that teachers are ready when they go to the classroom to create accessible materials, if they're creating their own, or they know what resources to use to make sure that their materials and instruction in the classroom are accessible. And so let's jump in a little bit into what digital accessibility is and why it is important. So as promised, answering your question, next slide. I've actually got two slides, kind of one here and then one in the section on how we legally define accessibility. But you often use the term accessible used interchangeably with is something available? Is it inclusive for people with disabilities? Is it affordable? Is it going to cost more than what everybody else is getting? And is it usable? Is it something that a student with a disability or a person with a disability can actually use? So you often hear those terms used interchangeably. So when we talk about digital accessibility, we're talking about whether people with disabilities can access digital content at the same time, the same speed as someone who doesn't have a disability.
Good. And just want to talk just for a second about accessibility in the physical world, because it kind of just helps us understand as we think about it, what it means in the digital world. And for a second, just going to talk a little bit about sidewalks for a second. Very common. We're all very familiar with sidewalks everywhere we go, and specifically about curbs, right? Where the road meets the sidewalk, there's usually a little bit of an elevation there. And if you go back a few decades, that's all we had everywhere was curb sidewalk, which made it difficult for some individuals to get from the street to the sidewalk or sidewalk down to the street. I think it was the earliest curb cuts that were ever found that we're going to talk about for a second. I think invented in Kalamazoo, Michigan. How great is that? There's a place in the world called Kalamazoo, Michigan. But it's still not very common at all. And then in 1973, there was the first kind of federal requirement that curb cuts be put in for federal buildings, right? And so users maybe that needed them could at least get into a federal building, but still not very common in your day-to-day usage. And then finally in 1990, as part of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it became a general requirement for all new construction and certain old construction to have curb cuts in place. And now curb cuts are very common. When you walked into the building, you used a curb cut to get in. Anywhere you go, grocery store, wherever it might be, you're going to find curb cuts. And so, with those curb cuts in place, they really make it easy for users with a number of different, mobility disabilities, maybe a walker or a wheelchair, to get from the sidewalk to the street or the street down to this side up to the sidewalk. And so that was a very specific kind of accommodation for users with disabilities. But as we think about curb cuts for a second, and this is something we'll carry over into the digital accessibility work, just think about it and shout out some examples of who or when you've used a curb cut. What other cases are curb cuts helpful besides for users with disabilities?
Strollers.
Strollers, good. Grocery carts.
Bikes.
Give me a few more examples.
Little kids.
What was that?
Little kids.
Little kids, yeah. Steps. Taking those little steps. That's a big step for a little 3-year-old, right? To get up onto a curb cut. And you've got the example here. Oh, there's my slide where I was going to ask that question on who uses curb cuts. But really, all different, anything with wheels, right? All of us, if we live long enough, will eventually appreciate curb cuts, right? That step gets bigger and bigger maybe over time. And so whether it be a grocery cart, strollers, luggage, hand trucks, dollies, right? Curb cuts are just so useful in our everyday life that even if there wasn't, legislation that required them, we would probably still do them because they just make life better for everybody. And so we're familiar with accessibility in the digital space, right? We see it everywhere with curb cuts, maybe with different drinking fountains, the size of doors, stalls in bathrooms, that type of thing we're very familiar with, but maybe not always as familiar with what that means with digital accessibility. So here's a slide on the screen, and behind the captions there on the slide is a picture of a video with captions. And that's just another example of a digital curb cut. Captions. And again, captions absolutely necessary and really created for users who are deaf or hard of hearing, right? Without captions, those users can't access the content of the video. It's just watching a screen. However, like curb cuts, there's a lot of different use cases for captions. Maybe in here, how many of you just even occasionally turn on captions when watching a video? Yeah, we can see almost every hand in the room goes up, right? Captions is really useful. What are some use cases like strollers, grocery carts, but for captions? Why do people use them besides for someone who's deaf or hard of hearing?
When my family comes to visit and they want to stay up later and they know that we went to bed, they will watch TV with captions. So they
You
don't.
can stay up late,
Yes, yeah.
or even in bed, right? If you have a partner in bed, you can stay up and watch your show while partner's snoozing. What else?
For me, British entertainment.
Oh, Especially in broad.
That BBC, those BBC movies, I love them, but sometimes I'm like, what did they say? So,
Yeah, that's fantastic. Good. Was watching a show that the dialects may be hard to understand.
yes.
Maybe a couple other examples. Why else? When else are captions useful?
Sometimes just movies have quiet moments or something that somebody says really fast that I'll miss.
And there's actually a trend where directors are using sound more creatively. That does make it just harder to understand what's being said sometimes. So turn on the captions, and you can. Good.
I like captions for notes.
Oh,
So after a lecture or something, you can
Yeah.
see those captions. And
Go grab those captions right out of there. Some of you have seen that interactive transcript thing where you can kind of search for a word and find it as well. Good.
When you're a grad student, you don't have time to watch every single video your professor assigned you, so you turn on captions at 2 times speed.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And
Yeah.
read that, yes.
Good. They also help with, please.
When you are just in a situation where you can't use volume.
Yeah. Some of you could be watching the latest episode of Severance right now back there. No spoilers.
please.
So yeah, and then other scenarios like language learners, like people learning English here, right? Or if there's a professor that, or a lot of other times you'll see it like bars, gyms,
Yeah.
airports always have captions on. They're just so useful and so helpful that it's one of those things where it's not like we shouldn't be having to convince people to use captions. It's like, why on earth wouldn't you do captions if that's the case sometimes, right? But yet, I mean, while we have captions on Netflix or whatever our favorite streaming platform is, a lot of times our educational content still may be missing some of that. And so that's where kind of our role steps in to help out with that type of content. Good, back to you.
Yeah. So when we're talking about, there's assistive technology, and then we also talk about accessible technology. So both, an A and a T. So not to get confused on this slide. So we're talking about accessible technology. But this is when you have hardware and software that can be operated with a variety of input and output options, which may be an assistive technology device, which is needed or just preferred by the user. So examples of this could be your desktop and your laptop can be used to access accessible technology, tablets and smartphones, a learning management system that you're using in the classroom, different curriculum or software program, and then apps and video players. All those things should be made to be used with whatever input or output option is needed by the user. So an example of the student who uses a screen reader because they have a visual impairment, everything they're doing on a desktop, or a tablet or whatever they're accessing should be accessible. And then Dr. Natalie Shaheen, who looks a lot at digital accessibility, she said, like accessible buildings, accessible technologies afford disabled users the same freedom of digital movement and functionality that they afford non-disabled people. So the same movement, the same freedom on your digital platforms. And then she said, moreover, accessible technologies require disabled people to expend substantially equivalent effort as non-disabled people to access those affordances. So to access your accessible content, you shouldn't have to do 5 more steps to get to it. You should be able to do it at the same pace as a non-disabled person should be able to. And then the last part of the quote, conversely, inaccessible technologies exclude and stigmatize many disabled people, restricting or denying their forms of digital movement and interaction. Just for example, everybody goes online to pay their utility bills now. If that's not accessible, that's a huge barrier for people with disabilities just to be able to do things that everybody else is doing and required to do as part of your daily life as a homeowner or, living in an apartment. You need access to those things. And so much of our life is done now on digital platforms that accessibility there is just as important as having a curb cut or an elevator in a building.
So with that, let's just talk about a couple of specific examples of what this looks like in different types of technologies. And our focus is kind of on K-12 education, but I think you'll find that most of us probably work with websites or have an organization that has a website of some type or another. And so what does it mean for a website to be accessible, for example? And with all of these examples, an important thing to remember is, and again, if we go back to that digital analogy, if I were to build a new building of some sort, I could build the building and then create the sidewalk. And then I could go back and have to retrofit it to have a curb cut, right? That's going to be really expensive to do that type of work. You have to get jackhammers and whatever to make that, turn that sidewalk into a curb cut, versus we can just build it accessible from the beginning. So that's a lot of what we're going to focus on. And sometimes if you come from a special education background, there's often a lot of focus on, we take in accessible content, whether it be a book or whatever it might be, and then say, how can we fix this to make it work for a person with a disability? Versus what if we just built it so it was accessible from the get-go, right? If a student comes into a classroom and has to ask for a video to be captioned, or should we just caption it up front and then everybody can benefit from that type of work? And so with all of these technologies, again, they can be built in a way that is accessible or a way that's not accessible. And we're not going to go into a lot of the technical details of this, but Brenda mentioned the idea of a screen reader, right? A tool that someone who's low vision or blind or for whatever reason is not able to maybe read a website content with their eyes, visually, they can have that content read out to them. If the website is accessible, there's a lot of different ways that might happen. And it has to be, in that case, it has to do with the HTML, right? And kind of the code underneath it. But if you have a website with your organization, whatever it might be, that's something you can ask about. Is our website accessible for users with disabilities? And it is. Sometimes we think like, oh, we're a part of a disability organization or human services, that it's probably it, but that's often not the case. If any of you want to have your laptops, there's a site you can go to. I don't have it in here, but just wave.webaim.org. wave.webaim.org. You can go there and put your website in it, and it'll give you some feedback on the accessibility of your website. That if you're the person, you can then fix that, or you might go to whoever that person is in your organization.
Can you repeat those?
Sorry, it's wave.webaim.org. WebAIM, sorry, WEBAIM.org. In fact, let me just.
I was gonna say, we should add that in
can
before we send the
we'll-
PowerPoint to.
Yeah, we'll be sure to include that for you. Let me just show you what that looks like real quick. I think we have a minute. If I just go wave.webaim.org. Does anybody want to be brave and tell me your website, or should we just put it in? Okay, go ahead.
Arthritis.org.
Arthritis.org.
Lovely.
I'll just take a picture.
It's just going to go out and scan that website real quick. And you'll see over here, again, I don't want to spend too much time going into the details of how this works. And this one, give me a second. Usually it's pretty quick. There we go. And so it'll tell us right over here on this side, there's basically a total of 42 errors on here that are now this doesn't cover everything. It's just some things that it can detect that could be problematic that we can go in and look at. On each of these, you can then come click on an icon. It'll give you some more specific information about like, where is that problem at, or how do I fix it? There's a lot of information here. And we won't spend a lot of time on this. I know there are training and resources available here, but for someone with arthritis, for example, they may not be able to use the mouse in the same way that someone without arthritis. So they might be a keyboard user. And there's things again you can do that allow someone to tap through a keyboard or a website with their keyboard, or that make it really difficult to do that. And so it's these little things like that can make it, or in this case, a lot of the errors are around contrast. Another example of a type of error where this white on the screen isn't quite stark enough of a contrast. Someone with low vision might have a little bit difficulty reading those words. But again, making it accessible is going to be more usable for everyone. Maybe you're looking at the site when you're on your phone in a sunny day, right? And the glare there. So just a quick example of what that might look like, but check out wave.webaim.org on your own and see what that might, see if it works for you.
Thank you.
This next one is just apps and tools. And again, we all have these that we use daily, whatever those might be when we open our phone, and our phones are incredible. I'll just, like I can, work real quick. Let me turn up my volume.
Voiceover on.
Haley Chuck, Utah Department of Health and
It can read out text from my phone, right? Again, if the content or the app is designed in a way that it can be accessible. And so whatever those apps and tools are that we use every day, you can't just assume that everybody's going to be able to fill out that form or use that whatever app might be when you download it, just to get something to keep aware of. Videos, again, we talked about captions on those videos and how useful that can be. There's also things you can do for users who are blind to make your videos more accessible. And then also things like a presentation here, right? And hopefully we've done a pretty good job on ours, but I mean, again, I'll just show one quick example of an easy thing you can do in a presentation is in PowerPoint, for example, you can just click on this review and then there's an accessibility checker built right in to PowerPoint that you can use before you send out a PowerPoint to a group. And we won't go into a lot of specifics, but there are a lot of resources on how to do that in a way that is accessible.
And that's also on Microsoft Word as well. So you can run an accessibility review. It'll tell you if you have any images that are missing alt text, or if there's anything that has poor contrast.
And if I click on that, it'll say like, oh, now this case, this video does have captions that we use, but it says, here's something you might want to look at. Here's why you need to fix it. And here's some steps you would need to take to fix it, for example. Those types of tools that are built into a lot of the tools we use every day that make it easier. And other things just like, using a big enough font, that type of stuff. These are just things we need to think about. These are our digital sidewalks that we want to make sure are accessible to users who need to use them.
And if you're having an oh shoot moment about your own website or any digital materials you have out there, I'll just, one of my favorite quotes, Maya Angelou said, do your best until you know better and then do better.
PM.
And this is something we're all learning.
Voiceover of.
We're all learning, we're all improving on this. This, it's not just something that, happens overnight, just like curb cuts. I mean, every neighborhood in the country is slowly turning over old sidewalks. My husband's a city planner, so I get to hear about these things all the time. But they're consistently examining older neighborhoods and putting in curb cuts, starting like closer to schools, and bus stops and things like that, but slowly trying to hit everything. And we do the same with digital stuff. There's a lot of really good resources out there, especially for us working in education, that are maybe 15, 20 years old, and they're still like the best resources out there. But now we need to go back and make sure that they're digitally accessible. So there's work to do. There always is. And so it's a process. So don't feel bad if you're suddenly like, oh my gosh, we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, especially now because I'm going to tell you about what laws you need to be following. So there's three main laws that relate to digital accessibility federally. The one that our program works with a lot is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. And under IDEA, states and school districts must provide accessible materials in a timely manner for students. And that's a little bit twofold. There's the idea that a student in a classroom should be able to access the curriculum at the same time and the same speed as their non-disabled peers. So if you're using a screen reader in the classroom, that student should be able to tab through and access the content at the same speed as their non-disabled peer sitting next to them, clicking on the screen. That also applies to students moving into a new school district who has an IEP set up that requires accessible materials. This one can get a little bit tricky because now the school district may not be used to providing all those materials and that content in the format that student needs. And so making sure that they get that as quickly as they can for that student. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes a month or two for a school district to get the right software or the right things in place for a student to be accessing their materials. And so under IDEA, they need to do that in as timely a manner as possible without. The second piece of legislation is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which addresses digital accessibility. And in fact, almost a year ago, the Department of Justice came out with a new final rule around Title II in the IDEA. And they revised it and very specifically called out web and mobile apps need to be digitally accessible. And they put some timelines on it. So all public agencies that serve over 50,000 people need to make sure that all their digital content is accessible by April of 2026. So this applies to large school districts, your state departments, counties, cities. They all need to make sure their web and mobile apps. For public agencies that serve less than 50,000 people, they have till April of 2027 to do that. So that is something that we are actively working on, getting some resources out about, and there's a lot of education going on. Because this doesn't just like apply to special education. This is all departments at the state level, it's not just school districts, it's your city government, your county government. They need to make sure that anything they're putting out there is digitally accessible. And then the third federal legislation is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which forbids any organization that accepts government funding from excluding individuals with disabilities. And so that again applies to digital content, because if it's not accessible, then that is exclusionary for people trying to access their resources, their programs, and their service.
There are a couple resources listed on here. We'll be sure to send these slides out, especially around this ADA Title II roadmap. If you're just getting started on this journey with whatever your agency is, it's a great kind of step-by-step, some things to start with and kind of what you.
And on our final slide, we'll have our website and some stuff there, and it's all posted there, all of our resources. Okay, so kind of back again to this idea around what is accessible. I shared some of those synonyms for earlier, but very specifically under federal law and guidance, when talking about accessible, that means an individual with a disability can access the same information, engage in the same interactions, conduct the same transactions, and otherwise participate or benefit from the same services, programs, and activities as an individual without a disability. And so that interaction needs to be substantially equivalent in timeliness, privacy, independence, and ease of use. So they should be having the same digital experience as a non-disabled person would.
Okay, now we're just going to talk a little bit about intersectionality and disability. And to start with this, I just felt a lot more comfortable going to some external sources. And this is an incredible, just 2-minute video from Microsoft that we're going to bring up real quick. It does a really good job of going over just intersectionality in. Okay, let me, and wonder if I should, I'll turn off one or the other. I'll try turning off these captions. We'll see how that does. This is a short video, but it does a good job of kind of laying the foundation for this discussion.
Hi, I'm Abeli at Microsoft. I want to tell you about our commitment to disability intersectionality. Intersectionality is the dynamic interactions between identities that influence and/or contribute to the experiences of diverse populations. Identities can include, but are not limited to, race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, and class. These identities should be viewed as interconnected and not as identities that can be considered independent of one another. For instance, a person who is Hispanic and female, or someone who identifies as LGBTQIA+ and has a disability are two examples of intersecting identity. Disability intersectionality focuses on how people with disabilities' lived experiences are impacted by their other intersecting identity. The intersection of disability and race sheds light on disabilities within the community. For example, Black and African American disabled communities are at greater risks for poorer health outcomes, including misdiagnoses and undertreatment. The intersection of disability and class, on the other hand, helps us understand how socioeconomics play into what different populations within disability communities have access to. For instance, lower income neighborhoods tend to have fewer sidewalks, accessible pedestrian signals, and marked crosswalks. Awareness of dynamics such as these are essential for developing strategies to overcome the social and technological barriers that fuel the inequities and inequalities disability communities face. For example, it can be used to identify gaps in education and support services for students with disabilities. By examining the interplay between disability and other identities, as well as the overlap between ableism and other forms of societal exclusions, we can bring greater understanding to the many types of human experiences. We believe investments in disability intersectionality are key for advancing on our goal to bridge the disability divide.
Discover a reliable energy solution that could help you gain more independence, providing peace of mind by reducing your dependence on the grid. Picture no longer worrying.
Super. As we watched it, I think just such an important part to remember this is, even probably 20 years ago, so much more of just the way we interact with the world was in kind of like physical bill. You'd have to maybe go to somewhere to pay a bill, or you'd have to fill out a form in person. And now so much of that experience, whether it be in education or whatever services you're involved with, have moved from that physical space to the online space. And so this work of just considering not just how our physical spaces, but also our digital spaces accessible, and how they are going to overlap with all different kinds of experiences that people are having in their lives are more important than ever. I just want to go over a couple more slides.
Hi, I'm Abeli at Microsoft.
These slides, I want to give acknowledgement to Haley Judd from the Utah Department of Health and Human Services, who recently gave a webinar, and we'll include the link to that when we send our resources out to another project. What is that project?
It's called Accessibility and Health Project.
Accessibility and Health.
The IDRPP.
Good. And she gave just a fantastic presentation on this. I'm just going to pull out a couple of slides from it. One thing she talked about is just making sure as we think about how many people are impacted by disability, right? And she shared some different statistics from different sources. 13.4% of U.S. adults, according to the American Community Survey. 28.7% of U.S. adults, according to the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. 9.3% of adults, according to the National Health Interview System survey. And she goes through a lot of reasons why these differences exist, and it's complex and really good insight. But just as we acknowledge this is complicated, as we talked about specific numbers, but Haley then did a great job kind of looking at some specific Utah-specific numbers. This is from 2022 and 23 in the state of Utah. Percentage of Utah adults by disability type, because we kind of think about digital accessibility in this space. That means something different for someone with a cognitive disability than it might be for someone with a visual disability. And so just for accessibility purposes, to go through this chart a little bit as we think about whatever the populations are that we serve, 14.4% of that population with a cognitive disability, 9.5% of the mobility limitation, 6.5% independent living disability, 6.4% difficulty hearing or deaf, 3.9% difficulty seeing or blind, and 2.4% is a self-care disability. These are from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System data specifically. But as we think about that, even if we're not serving a population targeted towards people with disabilities, whatever population we're serving is going to include a lot of individuals with disabilities. And whatever that disability is, and again, even among disabilities, there are going to be intersectionality. We need to consider what are the factors that are going to kind of impact that user's experience and how we help them or provide those services. And then this slide is so good. It also just speaks to, again, some of those differences. This is between Utah adults with a disability by race or ethnicity. You can kind of see on the chart here, there's a yellow line or an orange line that is the average across 26.9%. And then we can see, these different races or ethnicities that speak to some significant differences. We can see starting from the left again, I'll go over, but American Indian, Alaska Native, 30.6%. The Asian population, 18.8%. Black or African American, 29.7%, Hispanic, Latino, 30.9%, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, 40.1%, white, 25.8%, other is 27.1%, and then multiracial, 39%. And so this really, I think, speaks to that intersectionality, and for a variety of different reasons, where kind of being aware of the populations we're serving and how disability might be a part of that experience, and how accessibility might be a part of people's experience with whatever background and that they bring to the conversation. Just there for a second, Paul, any questions or insight on kind of any of this that we've Because we're almost to our questions.
Yeah, I think we are. Yeah. And so we got a couple questions to pose, but just thinking about intersectionality with other, individual identification factors, and I just came from the rural session, so I've been thinking about that as well, because 90% of Utah lives on the Wasatch Front, right? If you're in that other 10%, you are out in an extreme remote area. And when we think about digital access, we're like, oh, it's all online. Everybody should have access to the same thing because, you can get anything on your phone anywhere, but that's not exactly true. I mean, Salt Lake City is going to have a lot more resources and there's going to be a lot more programs than they are if you're, out in Juab County or somewhere like that. Things are going to be wildly different as far as what programs you have access to and even how good the digital resources are in your county programs out there. And so there's a lot of variability. On some of my other projects, I do a lot of work with the Bureau of Indian Education. We have some extremely remote school districts that don't have very good internet access and digital accessibility. And so that impacts those students very differently who may have the same disability as someone living in an urban area. So there's all these different intersectionalities that we deal with as well. So it's not all apples and apples as we walk this line. Anyway, so yeah, we got some questions. We want to hear from the group. What are your experiences with digital accessibility? Christopher and I can talk all day. No, we don't need to.
Now you know what digital accessibility is. At the beginning, you had an excuse maybe for, just think through this. As you consider the digital experiences, whatever those might be, with audiences that you provide support for.
So I'm in St. George region, and just even there, I mean, it's a larger city, but it's still rural. And so just even like the school district or other facilities, the hospital down there, they don't a lot of times even have the equipment for the individuals to use to get access. So that's just another huge component there.
Yeah, I think I'm Lily. And I'm thinking about that, just like the intersection too. You have access to the resources needed. Like, so we have a law saying you have to do it, but what support is there to actually do it? And that gets harder, right? Especially in rural places where your computers are 1 billion years old and you're just trying to.
Yeah. And people have to know that they even have that right. And
Exactly. Yeah.
people don't even know the questions to ask to get that.
Yeah.
That's true. And that's one thing our center is really working with, because we are working with parent centers and things. And what are the kinds of things that families need to be asking at schools, or what are the kind of things that individuals should request? Do they know what their rights are? But then, of course, the agency you're asking for support, they may have 100% best intentions. Yes, we want to do that. But what does the budget look like? What are their resources? Yeah.
Just one more thing. I'm thinking also about like the differences in like digital literacy. Like if it's a parent trying to know what's available and like to navigate that, you see like, and especially I think within a lot of like more marginalized communities, that digital literacy is lower. You don't have access to that. Like, yeah, like can you imagine like, oh, I know you're supposed to have access to something, but I have no idea what this app is, or oh, I accidentally turned on text to speech on my phone and now I can't turn it on and everyone's freaking out, which I've done before.
That's great. And your comment about resources, I don't think there's probably anybody that's in your agency looking at, we just need 1 or 2 more things to do, right? I mean, we're all stretched, I think, at an individual level, at an organizational level. And so, and this does take work. It's an additional thing to do. And so how do we start that conversation and figure that out? And what are the motivations to help us do that, right? To allocate some of those resources toward it. And I think a lot of us, here today, really have we're mission driven to provide access to as many people as possible. And so we start there, but also recognize that like with captions on videos, if your agency's videos aren't captioned, that's such an easy, good win. It just makes those videos more accessible, but just more usable, and they're going to be found by more people. They're just going to be watched. They're going to have a bigger impact. And then just know there are so many resources out there and people willing to, kind of help get those conversations started. But often it just needs one person to kind of just ask that question, right? You might have looked up your website. Is it accessible or not? Then they say, oh, hey, web person that helps with this, did you realize that we maybe need to do a little bit better here? Just to start those conversations, please.
Something I wanted to point out is sometimes those CEOs say, well, there's no way my organization agree to do all this whole infrastructure change, but sometimes starting small makes the biggest change.
I love that. Yeah, so maybe you have 100 documents on your website. You're like, it's going to be so much work to do all of this. What if we can just make the next one accessible though? And then as we have time and resources, talk to your legal counsel. There are some requirements out there that we need to be aware of. But if we can just start with a small step, that can make a big difference.
We will have access to that PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That should be the time.
I'm also thinking like on the first question about our adult self-advocates who have guardians who want access to the internet, to the digital space, but they're restricted from it, right?
Yes.
Maybe their guardians or caregivers are reticent, right, to allow them for fear of them getting taken advantage of or what they may see or do or things like that. But thinking through like how do we train the caregiver to be able to give like parental access so they can allow the youth or self-advocate that they're caring for to have access to digital spaces in a safe way rather than just saying no, never.
Yes.
That's a whole another aspect of accessibility that I think is important to consider. Do they even have a device or permission or
Yeah.
to go on Facebook?
Yeah.
Whatever that might be, or watch YouTube videos or waste their time just like all the rest of us, right?
Exactly.
Any other thoughts or questions you have? It's about you think about this type of work in what you do or the groups that you work with.
Last comment for me. County or state agencies in rural communities, sometimes they don't have the websites that are accessible. And I'm even thinking of like first responders and police departments and things like that. How do so many people, they have a difficult time knowing how to access it, to get this information on just from their websites, just for their local first responders. So
Yeah, and that's one thing is like getting information out there on like these are the expectations and these are like some initial steps you can take. Because again, until you do your best until you know better, right? But yeah, often in a lot of those smaller communities, you just have someone who knows a little bit about web editing, and so they get assigned to be the person to maintain the website, and so they need help, they need those resources, and sometimes it's not until someone says, "Hey, you're required to make it this way," and then they have to go and like rebuild and do it from the beginning. And unfortunately, a lot of the remediation is based on someone making a complaint, and that is what finally forces it to happen.
Again, if we can shift that conversation from you have to do this because of legal reasons and out of fear, like, hey, don't we want to do this because it's going to make it more usable for everybody? It's going to work better on your mobile device if you make it accessible. It's going to be better for our older population. It's going to be better for language. I mean, there's just so many people, right, that this can benefit. If we take that kind of approach to it, and even say, let's just start with one thing and see how it works. Then people can often find meaning in this work as well that can help just kind of snowball it into bigger and bigger efforts over time.
I think something that I've been encountering recently with one of my consumers is just period digital accessibility in terms of just knowing how to use a phone, knowing how to use, and she's getting older and her body is just breaking down, and she takes care of a child with a disability, an adult with a disability. And anyway, so it's just, and now it's like, well, I can go to the pharmacy in person to get the meds, but I don't know how to order them online. I don't even know how to use a computer.
Yes.
I've never had internet until actually this last month. That's when she first got internet in all her life. She's in her 60s. And so we're working on teaching her how to use the computer. And I have I'm not tech wizard.
Yeah.
But literally I'm sitting there and it's like, okay, you click this button. And it's like I don't know. And I was thinking, are there resources for digital literacy? Like, because I don't think we have anything, at least not in my county that I'm aware of.
Libraries are certainly a great resource in person, but there are some good. I wish I could remember the website, but it's like how to help my parents blank kind of.
Oh,
Just really basic type of thing. Good. One last comment.
I'm just thinking about in response to that, what you're mentioning and stuff that we've been doing in our transition to SharePoint at my job. And how that's, but we've been really trying to emphasize peer support in how we learn and navigate these things and are doing things like you're saying, like, well, we're just sharing our screen and we're learning together. And I'm thinking that there's probably like, if that's the, rather than like compliance or like lawsuit, it's like that. And we talked a little bit in the rural session about cultural humility, like digital, like, yeah, like like having, and maybe working with a library to do like peer support around this where people can come together. And I think centers, maybe the Center for Independent Living, centers for independent living are so good at that and taking that peer model into.
We try.
No,
We
we
try.
You may not be good at it, but you're good at
That's
peer
good to know.
support.
That's-
Yeah.
That's very important. Like,
You can all learn together.
yes. I know, like I need. So
Please.
can I come knock on your door? or
Yeah.
say-
Yeah.
I
From us, we got some questions.
Office is right next to there, so we do, that's what we want to do. What we do want to share at the end here is that, in our mission is specific to K-12 education. But if you're new to this and just need some references, there are so many incredible groups out there doing work, and we're happy to point in the right direction. Here's some information up here. We do have a handout you're welcome to take as well. We encourage you to visit our website, academy.org, NCADEMI. There's a newsletter there that you can sign up for. We're on LinkedIn. We're just doing our best to put out a lot of resources to help people from a place of not understanding anything about this or knowing what it is to figuring out where you're at and then what can you do next to get started on this journey towards becoming more accessible. I think that's it from us. We have just a disclaimer at the end. Thank you so much for coming today. We'll stick around if you have any questions.